On the night of June 26, 2026, inside the Paul VI Hall at the Vatican, 112 cardinals sat in silence. Pope Leo XIV stood at the podium holding a single sheet of paper. His hands did not tremble. His voice did not waver. But what he said next would send shockwaves through the entire Catholic Church because the words on that paper were not written that week. They were written decades ago in a small room in Peru by a young priest who never imagined he would one day become pope, and now he was finally reading them aloud to the most powerful men in the church. But before we get into what those words said and why they terrified half the Vatican, let me take you back to where this story truly begins. In 1988, a 33-year-old American priest named Robert Francis Post stepped off a bus in Trujillo, Peru. The air was thick with dust, the streets were cracked, and the country was at war with itself. Peru in the late 1980s was a place most Americans could not even imagine. Guerrilla groups terrorized the countryside. Car bombs shook cities at night. The military responded with brutal force. And in the middle of it all, the Catholic Church was the only institution still standing in many communities. Prevost had been sent there by his Augustinian order, not as a diplomat, not as an administrator, as a parish priest, a teacher, a man who would live among the poorest of the poor. He slept on a thin mattress in a room with no air conditioning. He ate what the villagers ate, rice and beans, and whatever fruit was in season. He woke before dawn and walked unpaved roads to reach chapels made of mud and wood, sometimes for miles, through heat that would make most Americans turn back before the first step. He taught canon law at the local seminary during the day. At night, he visited families who had lost sons to the violence. He held the hands of widows. He baptized babies born into poverty so deep that the idea of upward mobility was not even a concept people had words for. The Shining Path guerrillas controlled parts of the countryside. The military was equally brutal in its response. Car bombs destroyed markets. Electrical grids were sabotaged without warning, plunging entire cities into darkness. And in the middle of all this chaos, the church was often the only thing standing between communities and total collapse. Prevost did not run from any of it. He ran toward it. He volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. He traveled to villages other priests refused to visit. He sat with families during nights when gunfire echoed through the hills. And it was during those years, surrounded by suffering that would break most men, that something fundamental changed inside him. He saw things no seminary textbook could prepare him for. He watched mothers bury children who had been killed for nothing. He saw farmers work 18-hour days and still not have enough to feed their families. He watched local politicians promise change and deliver nothing. He watched the church, his church, stand by in too many cases, offering prayers when people needed protection. But what affected him the most was something quieter, something that happened in a small village outside Trujillo on a night he would never forget. A woman came to him after the evening mass. She was maybe 50 years old, but looked 70. Her name was Carmen. She had worked in a textile factory since she was 14. Her hands were scarred from the machines. Her back was bent. And she told him something that cut deeper than any theological debate he had ever had. She said, "Father, I have given my life to work, and my work has given me nothing, not even my dignity." Prevost did not sleep that night. He sat at the wooden desk in his small room and wrote in a notebook. Not a prayer, not a homily, a promise. He wrote it for himself, a personal vow. He wrote that if God ever gave him the authority to speak for the church, he would make sure the church never again stayed silent while workers were stripped of their dignity. He would fight for those who built the world with their hands and were rewarded with nothing. He never showed that page to anyone. He folded it, placed it inside his Bible, and carried it with him for the next 37 years. Through every appointment, every transfer, every promotion, through 12 years as head of the entire Augustinian order, traveling to nearly 50 countries, through his return to Peru as Bishop of Chiclayo, through his elevation to cardinal, through the conclave that made him pope, that folded piece of paper never left his Bible, and now in June 2026, he was finally keeping the promise written on it. But here is what makes this story so much more intense, because the promise was not just about words, it was about action. And the action Leo XIV was about to take would put him on a collision course with some of the most powerful forces inside and outside the church. To understand why, you need to know what had been happening in the months leading up to that night. On May 15th, 2026, Pope Leo XIV signed his first encyclical. It was called Magnifica Humanitas, and it was not what anyone expected. Most people assumed the first American pope would write about unity or dialogue or peace between nations. Instead, Leo wrote about artificial intelligence, about workers, about the human cost of the digital revolution. He signed it on the anniversary of Rerum Novarum, the famous 1891 encyclical by Pope Leo that defended workers during the Industrial Revolution. The timing was deliberate, the symbolism was unmistakable, and the choice was deeply personal, because when Robert Prevost chose the name Leo on the night of his election in May 2025, the world speculated about what it meant. Some thought it was a nod to Leo the Great, the ancient pope who famously confronted Attila the Hun. Others thought it was simply a strong name for a strong leader. But those who truly knew him, those who had walked with him through Peru and Rome and Chicago, understood immediately. He chose Leo because of Leo III, because of Ram Novarum, because of workers' rights, because of the promise. 2 days after the conclave, Leo explained his choice of name to the College of Cardinals. He referenced the historic message of Rerum Novarum and its relevance in the age of artificial intelligence. He asked the cardinals to renew their commitment to the principles of the Second Vatican Council, and he asked them to continue Pope Francis's vision of a church that champions the poor. It was all connected. Every choice, every word, every gesture, a thread running from a small room in Peru to the highest office in Christianity. Leo XIV was drawing a direct line from the factories of the 19th century to the algorithms of the 21st. He was saying that the same forces that once exploited human labor in coal mines and steel mills were now doing it through screens and code and invisible digital pipelines that most people never even think about. The encyclical was sharp, direct, almost aggressive by Vatican standards. It called artificial intelligence a tool that could either serve humanity or devour it. It warned governments and corporations that technology without ethics is not progress. It is a new form of oppression. And it contained a phrase that echoed around the world. Leo wrote, "In the era of artificial intelligence, when human dignity is threatened by new forms of dehumanization, ours is the pressing duty to remain profoundly human." The reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Workers' unions across Latin America and Europe celebrated. Advocacy groups called it the most important papal document in a century. But in Silicon Valley, in boardrooms across Wall Street, and in certain political circles in Washington, the response was cold fury. Before continuing with the story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive. Because Magnifica Humanitas did not just criticize technology in the abstract, it named specific practices. It called out companies that replaced human workers with automated systems without offering retraining or compensation. It criticized governments that allowed corporations to operate without accountability. It demanded a new global framework for workers' rights in the digital age, and that is when the backlash began. A top banker from one of the world's largest financial institutions requested a private meeting with the Pope at the Vatican just days later. According to sources close to the Vatican, the meeting did not go well. The banker tried to persuade Leo that the encyclical was too aggressive, that it would damage the Church's relationship with major donors, that the language about corporate accountability was reckless. Leo listened. Then he said 4 words that ended the meeting. "The Church is not for sale." The banker left the Vatican within the hour, and the story leaked within days. But Leo was not done, not even close, because Magnifica Humanitas was only the beginning. It was the public declaration. The real battle would come at the extraordinary consistory scheduled for June 26th and 27th. Now, most people outside the Catholic world do not understand what a consistory is. It is a formal meeting between the Pope and the College of Cardinals. It happens rarely, and when it does, it means something significant is about to change. Leo had called this consistory himself. He had announced it months in advance. He told the cardinals it would focus on 3 things: the state of the world, the pursuit of peace, and the implementation of the Sind, standard topics on the surface. But behind the scenes, Leo had a 4th agenda item, one that was not on any official schedule, one that he had been preparing in secret for weeks, and it connected directly to the promise he had made in that small room in Peru. 37 years earlier. The consistory began on the morning of June 26th with Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. Leo presided. The homily was brief but loaded with intention. He spoke about the vine and the branches from the Gospel of John. He talked about unity, about obedience, about listening. But those who knew Leo well heard something else between the lines. They heard a warning. He was telling the cardinals that change was coming and that resistance would not be tolerated. After Mass, the cardinals moved to the Paul V 6th Hall. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, the dean of the college, opened with a formal address. Then Leo spoke. His opening remarks were calm, almost professorial. He talked about the world they were called to serve, wars in the Middle East, political polarization in Europe and the Americas, the rise of nationalism, the refugee crisis that showed no signs of slowing down. Cardinal Re of Cov delivered a biblical meditation. There was prayer, silence, group discussion, reports. Then came the afternoon session, and everything changed. Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, introduced the theme, the culture of power and the civilization of love. He drew heavily from Chapter 5 of Magnifica Humanitas, the section that directly addressed institutional responsibility. But it was what happened after his presentation that no one expected. Leo stood up. He walked to the center of the hall. He did not use the podium. He did not read from notes. He looked directly at the assembled cardinals and spoke from memory. He told them about Peru, about the buses and the dust and the war, about the families he had served, about the woman named Carmen, about the night he sat alone and wrote a promise he thought no one would ever read. Several cardinals later said they had never seen anything like it. The Pope standing before them without formality, without protocol, telling them a story from his youth as if they were sitting around a kitchen table. And then he made his announcement. He said the Vatican would establish a new political commission for the protection of workers' dignity, not an advisory board, not a study group, a commission with real authority, real funding, and a direct mandate from the Pope himself. The commission would investigate labor practices in countries where the Church had significant presence. It would partner with international labor organizations. It would issue binding recommendations to Catholic institutions around the world regarding their own employment practices. And it would hold governments and corporations publicly accountable when workers' rights were violated. The room went quiet, not because the cardinals disagreed. Many of them had been advocating for exactly this kind of action for years, but because of the scope, the ambition, the directness, this was not a symbolic gesture. This was the Pope drawing a line in the sand, and he was not finished. Leo then addressed something that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. The Society of St. Pius X, a breakaway traditionalist group, had announced plans to consecrate 4 bishops without papal consent on July 1st. The Vatican had already warned that such an act would constitute a schismatic offense carrying automatic excommunication. Leo had sent envoys, he had offered dialogue. The SSPX had refused to back down. Standing before the cardinals, Leo acknowledged the situation with a pain that seemed genuine. He said division among Christians is always painful. However, they refused to accept certain fundamental elements of the Church, starting with various points of the Second Vatican Council. And while I regret that choice, we must move forward. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was something more powerful. It was resignation without surrender, sadness without weakness, a leader who had tried every door and found them all locked. And then he pivoted back to the commission, back to workers, back to the promise. He said something that several cardinals would quote in interviews for days afterward. He said, "The Church chose the name Leo, not by accident. Leo think gave the world Rerum Novarum because the Industrial Revolution was crushing the human spirit. We face a new revolution now. And the human spirit is being crushed again. This time by algorithms, by invisible chains, by a system that measures people in data points instead of dignity." He paused. Then he added, "I made a promise once in a small room to no one but God and myself. That promise said the Church would never again stay silent while workers are stripped of their humanity. Today I am keeping that promise." The hall erupted, not in applause. Cardinals do not applaud during formal sessions, but in something harder to describe, a collective exhale, a shift in the room's gravity. Several older cardinals were seen wiping their eyes, but not everyone in the room was moved in the same direction. A small group of cardinals, mostly from European financial centers, exchanged glances. They had concerns, real concerns. A commission with binding authority over Catholic institutions could disrupt long-standing arrangements with governments and corporations that funded church operations in their fasces. It could open the Vatican to legal challenges. It could alienate donors. One cardinal, whose name has not been publicly revealed, approached Leo during the evening dinner that followed the session. He reportedly told the Pope that the commission was admirable in theory but dangerous in practice. Leo's response, according to 3 sources who were present, was brief. Then, let it be dangerous. The second day of the consist, June 27th, was no less intense. The morning session focused on peace. Cardinals from war-torn regions spoke about the conflicts devastating their communities, the ongoing crisis in the Middle East, the humanitarian disaster in Sudan, the growing instability in parts of Southeast Asia. Leo listened to every single one. He took notes, he asked questions, and when the session ended, he made a second announcement that caught even his closest advisors off guard. He said the new commission would not only focus on traditional labor practices, it would also investigate the human cost of artificial intelligence in developing nations, specifically the thousands of low-paid workers in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America who are hired to train AI models by labeling images, moderating violent content, and performing repetitive digital tasks for pennies per hour. These are the invisible workers of the digital age. They sit in offices in Nairobi and Manila and Bogota are clicking through thousands of images every day, teaching machines to see and think. Some of them are exposed to graphic violence and disturbing content for hours on end with little psychological support. They earn a fraction of what the technology they help build generates in profit. Leo had learned about this reality during the research phase of Magnifica Humanitas, and it had struck him with the same force as the stories he had heard in Peru decades ago. Different century, different technology, same exploitation, same invisibility, same silence from those in power. This was the first time any major religious leader had addressed this issue so directly, and it connected perfectly to the encyclical. Magnifica Humanitas had laid the philosophical groundwork. The commission would be the enforcement mechanism. Leo was building a system, not just making speeches, and the implications were enormous because the companies that rely on this kind of invisible labor include some of the largest technology firms in the world, companies with lobbying power, companies with political influence, companies that do not appreciate being told how to treat their workers by a religious leader. The response from the corporate world came swiftly and predictably. Anonymous sources from several major tech firms told reporters that the Vatican was overstepping its authority. One executive was quoted as saying, "The Pope should focus on saving souls, not regulating business." Leo did not respond directly, but the Vatican press office released a statement that was unmistakably his voice. It said, "Saving souls and defending human dignity are not separate tasks. They are the same mission." Meanwhile, the political fallout was also escalating. Donald Trump, who had already clashed with Leo over the Iran crisis earlier in the year, posted on Truth Social that the Pope was totally out of his lane and should worry about empty churches instead of telling American companies how to run their operations. Leo did not engage. He never engages with social media attacks directly, but those close to him say he reads them, all of them, and that they only strengthen his resolve. Because this is the thing about Leo XIV that most people do not understand. He is not reckless, he is not impulsive, he is a mathematician by training, a man who earned his degree from Villanova University, and who still thinks in patterns and probabilities. He is a canon lawyer by education, trained at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, where he learned that every rule exists for a reason, and every exception must be justified. He is a diplomat by experience, having spent 12 years as head of the Worldwide Augustinian Order, traveling to nearly 50 countries, learning how to navigate bureaucracies and cultures and personalities that most people would find impossible to manage. He speaks 5 languages fluently: English, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French. He can switch between them in the same conversation without missing a beat, and in each language he sounds not like a foreigner trying to communicate, but like a man who belongs there. Every move he makes is calculated, every statement is measured, every silence is intentional. And the promise he made in Peru was not an emotional outburst. It was a strategic commitment that he spent 37 years preparing to fulfill. He had waited patiently through positions that gave him increasing power, but not yet enough. Through years when he could see the problems clearly but did not yet have the authority to address them at the scale they demanded through a pontificate under Pope Francis, where he was being groomed perhaps unknowingly, perhaps deliberately for the very moment he was now living. Francis had seen something in him. The late Pope had spent Saturday mornings at Casa Santa Marta talking with Prevost about the church, about the world, about the future. Those conversations lasted hours, and they planted seeds that were now blooming in ways Francis might have hoped for, but could never have fully imagined. The consistory ended on the evening of June 27th, with the singing of the Tetum and a dinner in the Paul VI Hall. Leo sat with the cardinals. He ate simply. He spoke quietly. He smiled. But inside, according to those who know him best, he was already thinking about the next step, because the commission was just the beginning. The real fight was about to start, and it would start in a place no one expected. Because what most people did not know, what most of the cardinals did not know, was that Leo had already been in secret contact with the International Labor Organization in Geneva. For months, his personal envoy had been holding private meetings with ILO officials, laying the groundwork for a formal partnership between the Vatican and the world's leading authority on workers' rights. This had never happened before, not at this level, not with this kind of institutional commitment. The announcement would come later in July, but the deal was already done, and it would change the Church's relationship with the secular world in ways not seen since the Second Vatican Council, all because of a promise written on a folded piece of paper in a small room in Peru. There is a detail about that night in Trujillo that Leo has never shared publicly, but people close to him have spoken about it in private, always with the same sense of reverence. After he wrote his promise, after he folded the paper and placed it in his Bible, he did not go to bed. He sat in the dark for hours. The sounds of the Peruvian night surrounded him, dogs barking in the distance, a radio playing somewhere down the street, the hum of insects against the window screen, and he prayed, not with words, not with formulas. He just sat in the silence and let the weight of what he had seen settle into his bones. He was not a bishop yet. He was not a cardinal. He was not even a prominent priest. He was just a man in a room who had seen too much suffering to stay quiet, and who had made a decision that would take him nearly 4 decades to act on. That is what makes this story different from the usual Vatican drama. This is not about politics. This is not about power struggles between cardinals or diplomatic chess with world leaders. This is about a young priest who looked into the eyes of a woman whose hands were destroyed by machines and whose spirit was crushed by indifference, and who decided in that moment that if the church would not speak for people like her, then the church had failed its most basic mission. And now, from the highest office in Christ Resendum, he was making sure it would never fail that way again. The days following the consistory were electric. Vatican correspondents scrambled to piece together what had happened behind closed doors. Leaks came slowly at first, then in a flood. The story about the promise in Peru spread through Catholic media like wildfire. Newspapers in Lima ran front-page stories about the woman named Carmen. Journalists tried to find her. They searched the villages outside Trujillo. They interviewed elderly parishioners who remembered Padre Roberto, the quiet American priest who walked the dusty roads and sat with families during the darkest years. Nicanor Palacios, a man who had served as an altar boy alongside Pritos during those early years in Pora, told a reporter, being the junior priest, he was often sent out into the field. He never complained. He never asked for a better assignment. He just went. Others who had known him in Chiclayo, where he later served as bishop from 2015 to 2023, spoke about his dedication to Venezuelan migrants who had flooded into the region fleeing political chaos. He had coordinated local churches, NOSs, and government agencies to provide shelter, food, and medical care. He had visited the migrant shelters personally, not once, not for a photo opportunity, regularly, quietly, without cameras. No one found Carmen. Some speculated she had died years ago. Others suggested Leo may have changed her name to protect her identity, but her story, the story he told the cardinals that night, became a symbol of every worker who had ever been rendered invisible by the systems that profited from their labor. Workers' groups in the Philippines, in Bangladesh, and Brazil began citing it. Union leaders quoted Leo's words in negotiations. Activists posted his phrase about dignity on social media in dozens of languages. And inside the Vatican, something shifted. Cardinals who had been cautious began speaking more openly about labor rights. Bishops in Africa and Asia started reaching out to the new commission before it was even formally established. The momentum was undeniable. Leo watched it all from the apostolic palace where he lived with a small community of his Augustinian brothers. He had moved there after renovations were completed in the early weeks of his papacy, a decision that carried its own symbolic weight. Pope Francis had chosen to live in the simpler Casa Santa Marta. Leo chose the apostolic palace, but not for its grandeur. He chose it because the renovated apartments allowed him to live in community, keeping the Augustinian tradition of shared life that had defined his vocation since 1977. He woke early, usually before 5. He prayed in the private chapel before anyone else was awake. He celebrated Mass with his brothers. He ate breakfast with them simply, often in silence. Then he worked documents, meetings, phone calls to bishops on 3 continents, reviews of commission proposals, edits to speeches, approvals for appointments, the machinery of a global institution that never stops turning. He reviewed documents late into the night, often past 11. His staff had learned not to send him anything after midnight because he would read it immediately and respond, and they worried about his rest. But he never complained about the workload. His closest advisors said he seemed energized by it, as if the weight of the papacy, rather than crushing him, was giving him the purpose he had waited his entire life to fulfill. And every evening before bed, he opened his Bible to the page where that folded piece of paper still rested. He did not read it anymore. He did not need to. He knew every word by heart, but he touched it every night. A ritual, a reminder, a connection to the man he was before the white smoke and the balcony and the weight of 1 billion souls. On the morning of June 28th, just 2 days before the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, Leo met with his closest advisors. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it ended, one of them told a Vatican journalist off the record that the Pope had used a phrase none of them had heard before. He had said, "We are not building a legacy. We are paying a debt to Carmen, a debt to every worker whose hands had been broken by machines and whose dignity had been stolen by systems that treated them as replaceable parts. A debt to the young priest who once believed the church could change the world, and who had spent a lifetime making sure it would. The commission would be formally announced in July. Its first investigations would begin in September. Its first report would be presented to the College of Cardinals before the end of 2026. And Robert Francis Prevost, the boy from Dalton, Illinois, who used Nicafers as communion hosts and turned his mother's ironing board into an altar, who walked the dusty roads of Peru as a young man and sat in silence in the dark, making promises to God, would finally see those promises fulfilled. Not because power had changed him, but because he had refused to let power change the promise. The morning of June 29th arrived with the golden light of a Roman summer pouring through the windows of St. Peter's Basilica. Leo presided over the Mass for the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. The basilica was full, cardinals in red, bishops in purple, pilgrims from every corner of the world. Just weeks earlier, Leo had returned from an historic apostolic journey to Spain, his second international trip, where he had visited Madrid, Barcelona, and the Canary Islands. In Madrid, he had spoken to hundreds of thousands about faith in the modern world. In Barcelona, he had visited the monastery of Montserrat. In the Canary Islands, he had met with migrant communities and spoken about the dignity of every human life, no matter where it begins. The Spain trip had shown the world a pope who was not content to stay behind Vatican walls, a pope who would go to the people, not wait for them to come to him. And now back in Rome, standing in the basilica where Peter himself was buried, Leo brought that same energy to the most important feast day in the Catholic calendar. In his homily, Leo did not mention the commission. He did not mention the consist. He did not mention Peru or Carmen or the promise. Instead, he spoke about Peter, about the fisherman who was asked to leave everything behind, who stumbled, who denied, who failed, and who, despite all of that, was given the keys. Peter was not chosen because he was perfect, Leo said. He was chosen because he was willing to try, willing to fail, willing to get up again, and willing in the end to give everything. Those who knew the context heard the subtext clearly. Leo was talking about himself, about his own journey, about the failures and the doubts and the decades of waiting, and about the willingness, even now at 70 years old, to fight a battle that most men his age would consider already lost. After Mass, Leo returned to the Apostolic Palace. He ate lunch with his brothers. He took a short walk in the gardens, and then he went to his study, sat down at his desk, and began writing. Not an encyclical, not a speech, not a formal document, a letter to Carmen, wherever she was, whether she was alive or not. A letter he would never send, but needed to write. He wrote, "I kept my promise. It took me longer than I hoped, but I kept it, and I will keep fighting until every worker in every country on this earth is treated with the dignity that God intended." He folded the letter. He placed it inside his Bible next to the original promise. 2 pieces of paper, 37 years apart, written by the same hand, driven by the same fire. And the church, whether it was ready or not, would never be the same. If this story moved you, if you believe in a church that fights for the forgotten, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling us what you think of Pope Leo's promise. And stay tuned, because this story is far from over.